Thank you, everybody, for joining today. I'm really excited about this one. My name is Caitlin Durkin. I'm the manager for Network Partner Relations at Best Friends Animal Society, but I am just here to get you all started. First, I want to thank everyone who is either attending live or who is watching the recording. So I know that everyone in this room has a really difficult job that's really busy, and you are still making time to come here and learn from each other and try to do better for the animals and for your communities. And that is really huge and really hard to do. So thank you, everyone, for that. I'm going to turn things over to Tawny Hammond, the Director of No-Kill Advancement at Best Friends Animal Society. She'll be our moderator for today, and she will be introducing all of our panelists.
Thank you, Caitlin. Thank you so much. It's good to be with everybody. And big shout out to everybody. I'm watching the chat, seeing all the people saying hello and where you're from around the country. We're going to get right to it. I've got an esteemed panel, my friends and colleagues that have been at this for a while. They've been doing the work that we're going to be talking about today, and they are super excited to share information with you all. And one thing I want to point out is that, we teach best what we need to learn the most. More than anything, we're going to be discussing and sharing what we've learned, and we're going to learn in the process. That's the beautiful part about these discussions, is that we learn from each other by sharing. First of all, I'd like to introduce my friend Heather Owen. She's the executive director and co-founder of One Tail at a Time. Thank you, Heather, for being here. And my good friend Lawrence Nicolas, president of Jacksonville Humane Society. Hey, Lawrence. And Misha Goodman. Wait a minute, all three of y'all are graduates of the Executive Leadership Certification Program with Best Friends Animal Society. I just realized that. Misha Goodman, Animal Care Services Director of Bernalillo County Animal Care Services. Welcome, Misha. And last but certainly not least, my friend and colleague at Best Friends Animal Society, Dawn Binion-Stewart, the Director of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Belonging, also known as DEIB for the acronym. Thank you, Dawn, for being here today. All right, we're going to get right to it, folks. I've got a question I want to start us off with that I think is an important one, and this is really open to everyone on the panel. What do you think? Because, we're talking about changes. We're talking about opening up adoptions. There's some concerns. There's some challenges. There's some barriers. And there's maybe some fears. And we know that exists. So let's talk about this. What do you think are the biggest fears we have about making adoptions, and to include possibly foster placement, which is a step to adoption, right? So what do you think are the biggest fears we have about making adoptions and foster placements easier?
So, Tawny, I'm going to go ahead and say a little bit about that. I think, people are just scared that somehow something negative might happen to the animals that they're trying to have positive outcomes for. They're scared that they might be harmed or used in a way that would be undesirable. And I think that we put a lot of these practices in place to hopefully try and prevent those things from happening. But I would say that's kind of, one of my colleagues mentioned this the other day, an illusion of control. Like, we believe that gives us control, but in fact, in many, many ways, it actually doesn't. And so I would start with that.
Thank you, Misha. It's a really good
point. And I would add similar. I think that we're afraid of putting an animal in a situation that's unsafe or dangerous. And, we see headlines and news, and we know that those kinds of things do happen. But I think one lesson that I've learned, and it's a hard thing to keep in mind, but here in Jacksonville, and I think in most communities, the reality is the most dangerous place to be a dog or a cat is the shelter system. That's where most lives are lost. So whatever we can do to have an animal exit the shelter system or be in a safe home environment, that is a safer alternative to where they likely are right now. So keeping that larger perspective in mind, I think is really important when we're faced with those fears.
It's a really good point. Lawrence, I think we've trained people for really generations, decades and generations, that the right thing to do, you know, along with voting and recycling and giving blood and all these things that we do in our society to be good contributors. You bring an animal to an animal shelter, right? And so people are just doing what they're trained to do, not knowing that it can be the most dangerous place for that pet, right?
Absolutely. And then those of us here who are in the shelter system or with a rescue group that supports the shelter system, it really is our responsibility to get the animals out, to get them into a safe placement. Because yeah, I mean, we are an amazing life-saving organization. Our city shelter is as well, but the reality is that it's not 100%. It's not the safest place to be a dog or a cat. Things happen. There's disease. I mean, who knows, right? So if we are able to get an animal out of a shelter and into a home, that's one more animal that we can save. And even if you're not a shelter, if you are a rescue that supports your shelter nearby, you being able to place one more and save one more from that shelter, that really is the difference. That really is saving another life.
Yeah, and I think I want to make sure that I really stress and underscore that when we talk about it not being a safe place for pets, we're not talking, it's not a criticism or negativity against the hardworking, amazing humans that are trying to make it a safe place. They're trying to make sure these dogs and cats and animals don't break with disease. They're trying to make sure that they stay emotionally and physically and mentally sound, and they don't do something behaviorally that's going to cost them their life. So it's not for us not trying. Everybody's trying. But to, what you were saying, to your point, Lawrence, is it's simply not. You're in a closed building where disease can break despite our best efforts. And also, too, different animals behave differently in confinement. So we just I want to make sure that nobody thinks that we're being disrespectful to all the hard efforts to make it a safe environment. But the fact of the matter is, quite often, it doesn't end up that way statistically for some animals, right? So anybody else on the panel want to talk about what are some of our biggest fears that get in the way of making adoptions easier?
Yeah, I saw a lot of people from rescues and probably foster-based rescues, and that's what One Tail at a Time really started as, and we are primarily foster-based now. So I think a lot of it is fear that it's going to cause us a lot of extra work because we're going to get a bunch of returns or have a bunch of problems, and we are already so busy and so stretched. So thinking about adding emergency returns is super stressful. One Tail went on a journey to remove a lot of the barriers. So when we started, we did all of the checks, landlord checks, home checks, reference checks, you name them, we did them. And we removed them sort of one by one. And that was the biggest fear of everyone that was part of our organization. And it just never came. That doesn't mean we don't have some emergency returns, but we had emergency returns before too. So we did not see a blow up on that. It never came. So
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was a question that we got prior to the webinar, that, if you open up adoptions, are we going to see an increase in returns? What's the reality? I know sometimes we have fears, and anecdotally, 1 or 2 times or 10 times can suddenly in our mind be 100 times. What have you all experienced, and what are your thoughts about if we're making adoptions easier? Is it going to return if you make it easier and people aren't running that gauntlet or going through all these multiple steps for adopting? A bad decision could be made, and then you're going to have returns increasing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, we haven't seen that at all. We certainly get returns, no doubt about it. And we have a policy that we will take back any of our adopted animals anytime in their life. That's just a policy that I put in place years ago. It's worked really, really well. And we feel we're municipal, so we're serving our customers. And we also encourage them to rehome. If they can no longer keep the animal, that we give them resources to rehome that animal instead of return it if they'd rather do that. And a lot of people do that.
Yeah. So, and anytime I talk about this, sometimes I get a little pushback from rescues because some people maybe have seen returns, but our animal base is primarily large dogs and primarily large adolescent idiot dogs. So we're dealing with some of the hardest, like, animal base out there. And if we, doing open adoptions doesn't mean you don't support your adopters afterwards. So like Misha, we stay in touch. We say we can help you, we can accept a return, and returns happen, absolutely. And we just work with people so that we don't have a bunch of emergency returns. I can count on one hand how many times people have been like, no, take this dog right now. And we do thousands of adoptions every year now. So in terms of, sheer number of returns, yes, that's gone up only because we're doing so many more adoptions. So you have to be ready to be able to scale up, which is like the most exciting problem to have. But if you're not scaling up, you're not taking in more animals and not doing more, I don't think you're going to see an increase in your return rate.
And another
Tawny,
thing I'd like to add to that too, if all right, is, I feel like whenever we start to talk about adoption returns, I always push back against, relationships for humans. That there's an expectation when you adopt a pet that you're going to meet this pet for an hour and you're going to make a lifetime decision. But meanwhile, you date and you marry and maybe you divorce and you marry again. And like those things are just part of our lives. But we don't have that same expectation or allowance for our adopters. And that's just, I think that's unreasonable to say that we expect them to make a lifetime decision over the course of 15, 30, 45 minutes. And if they return the pet because it's not the right fit for their family, then, great, let's help them find the right fit for their family. And maybe we learn something else new about that pet while they were there. And what's, I guess, trying to break down the stigma or the negative connotation around the return, because we want what's best for the pet. We want what's best for the person. And sometimes that takes a handful of tries because we're people and things change. And who could ever know?
Right. That's a really good point. And by adding, let's say we have all these steps in our adoption process, by adding a couple of hours, is it really going to make the match better? If somebody has to fill out more paper or answer more questions or, prove that they're a good pet parent, they still may get the pet home and where animals relax and they can be their true selves. And it still may not be the best fit. And that pet got out of the shelter, had an overnight or a week or a weekend or a month of not being in a kennel. And so it's not the end of the world. It's a good point. I want to pivot right now and talk a little bit let's talk about the repercussions of restrictions and consequences. All of you have been part of change. You've experienced it. You've seen it. Either you've done it yourself or you've worked in systems where there were bottlenecks and pain and pinch points and getting dogs and cats out of the shelter alive. There's repercussions, isn't there? What are some of the repercussions and consequences of when we slow that life-saving process down with some hurdles?
I mean, I think the first thing is that we greatly reduce the possible field of adopters. So if we're saying you can't adopt if X, Y, or Z, that takes a lot of people out of the equation. And Best Friends just put out, I think, like incredibly compelling data that if we got 6% more people who are going to acquire animals this year to acquire them from us, we close our gap and we're no kill. We save all the animals. 6%, that's so like within reach. But if we're continuing to reach out to the same people over and over and over again and butting our heads against the wall, and this year has been very rough for I think a lot of people, reality is we need to expand. We need to capture more people. And so if we have barriers in place that keep those people away from us, either from technicalities and our rules, or because they don't want to come to a rescue that's going to, ask them for, their pay stubs and stuff like that. Like, we're just taking so many people out of the equation that could save these animals for us.
Right.
I just want to piggyback on that too, Heather. What I would say too is that when that happens, it gets into the community, right? When people are saying that, oh, okay, maybe this shelter is not accepting or requiring this and that. Word of mouth is powerful, right? In the community, people will talk, and if a person comes into a shelter and they're not feeling that they're trusted or that they are a qualified adopter, people will know about it, not just that adopter. It becomes like telephone, that old game of telephone. It just gets spread out throughout the community.
Totally agree, Dawn. And I'll even expand on that too, that John Q. Citizen doesn't know the difference between the Jacksonville Humane Society versus our Animal Care and Protective Services versus any of the 7 rescues that are in our community doing adoptions. For the average adopter, we're all the same thing. We're the animal people, right? So if one bad experience is had by an adopter anywhere, that affects all of us. That's, it's just we're just one big lump to most. It's unreasonable to expect the average person to understand the nuance of jurisdiction or private versus public or any of that. Like that's not reasonable. So whenever anybody, if someone in our community has a bad experience trying to adopt a pet from one of us, that's going to negatively affect all of us. They're not going to go to the other shelter. They're going to go to the pet store. They're going to go to wherever else is much easier to get a pet. And it hurts their entire community at once.
I also want to say, Tawny, too, that it is straining on facilities that have had a hard time maintaining staff levels. The time it takes to put some of these measures in place and to make sure that they're occurring, whether it be, the long application and reviewing that or whatever it may be, takes time. And so we're taking time again away from how many adopters we might be able to meet in a day, how many animals we might be able to get out in any given day, and how much the staff can really manage and handle the processes that we put in place. So the fewer processes, of course, the more streamlined the situation, the adoption, and the faster it goes and the more animals can get out the door.
No, totally. Makes a lot of sense. Just listening to you all talk, just thinking about what I've experienced in my career, those examples make so much sense of when we're putting those barriers up. Statistically, when we look at data, we're not necessarily getting, when you think about what motivates us to do those things, to put those in place when we're talking about fears, we're not getting to that anyways by doing those things, right? It's just kind of like a feel-good thing, but data-wise, it doesn't play out.
And Tawny, I just want to add, I'm probably one of the oldest people on this webinar, and I've been in the industry for 42 years. And it's like anything else, it goes like this, and we come up with a great idea, and then 2 years later we decide it's not a great idea. And so being inventive and changing things doesn't necessarily hurt anything. It just gives us more ideas, more data. We learn from it. And so people shouldn't be scared to try new things and try them on a pilot level instead of doing it permanently in policy. Just try it out, see how it goes.
Yeah. You said my favorite word, pilot program. I love that. And we're not going to get into that in the webinar, but it is one thing I just want to do a shout out before I ask the next question to the panel is when, a lot of people are afraid of change, particularly maybe your chain of command, your boss's boss, and maybe your team, your staff, your stakeholders. We'll talk about stakeholders in a second as well. Stakeholders being your customers, your community, your volunteer program volunteers, your donors. But people are afraid. And a pilot program is such a great way to kind of disarm that and say, look, we're just going to try it for 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. Then we're going to evaluate it. And we're going to see if some of those fears came to fruition and if we can mitigate for those. And it's a pilot. There's no permanency to it. And that's a really good way. I used it in my career for my boss to say, okay, I worked for the chief of police in Fairfax. He said, okay, it's a pilot program, so I can handle any repercussions I get from my superiors that we're trying this out to see to test for efficacy and to see if we realize our goals. They love pilot programs because it's not permanent. And if it's successful, you can make it permanent. If you have problems, you can tweak for those problems. So you said pilots it's like Pee-wee's Playhouse. Pilots like the word of the day. I'm dating myself. You talk about you being the oldest one, Misha. Oh, wait, Caitlin got it. I want to talk to Dawn. I'm sure you have something to say about this as well. This is for the whole panel. How has opening up your adoptions created a more equitable and inclusive environment, organization, and/or culture? So when we talk about opening up adoption, and we think about inclusivity and equity, and we think about our own organization's culture, and we think about our community, it seems to me like there's a direct correlation with the topics.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And, just thinking about that right now, if I think about what I know a lot of adoption applications look like around the country, 99% of our staff wouldn't be able to adopt. And these are people who work they work here. They are giving 40 or more hours every single week to this work, and they don't have a fence or they don't have a regular veterinarian yet because they're just entering the workforce. And how could they have those things? They're new. If we, by opening our doors to everybody, that builds that culture that's our staff is representative of our community and vice versa, and it just really opens that door of community for everybody.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, opening up of removing the barriers are so important, because there's so many, we're all humans, right? And there's so many people who love animals, right? And each person grows up in a different culture. And a lot of times, some of the barriers that are created based on people's culture, whether people realize it or not. And so there's a real importance around understanding the differences in culture. And earlier, when you asked the question about Tawny, about fear, what keeps us from doing things, and I think a lot of it is the unknown, right? And not understanding how different people are raised, how different people how their families interact. A lot of times there's multiple families in a home. Sometimes that's not acceptable to people. And yet that's something that is very common, right? And so we look at it like, okay, this house has a lot of human beings in it. How do they have room for a dog? They have love for a dog. They have love for a cat. Why can't they fit in there? Right? And it's really kind of taking a step back and understanding different cultures, because that's how you make connections. And when you make connections, when the dog may or cat may come in, then you have that opportunity to rehome. I was in New York last week at our lifesaving center, and there was a cat that was brought back in, right? And during the conversation that our staff was having, it was really about that connection and how can we support you in learning more about cats. And because of that, that person actually came back in and actually adopted a different cat, right? So maybe that cat wasn't the right cat for their home, but they learned about them as they were having that conversation, learned about, okay, and this might seem small, but for some people, there's 15 dimensions of DEIB that are very common, right? And one of it is the socioeconomic status. And for this family, furniture was very, very important for them, right? And so they had a conversation about that, right? About, okay, this is their culture, this is so on and so forth. And maybe people in animal welfare does not understand that per se, but understanding where that person's perspective is coming from, and then finding an animal that would fit them, that person walked out with another animal. So it just worked out. It's really just understanding what people's culture is and making those connections.
That's a really good point. And I think too, we learned this in the education system, I think, or hopefully we're still learning it. We're always in progress, right? How biased tests and questions can be, and teaching styles. And the same goes for in animal services. We don't even sometimes know our biases are being displayed. And the questions we ask, the assumptions we make, we're not even thinking about it, right? And I remember in my career in Virginia, one of the requirements, if you were going to buy what they were calling at the time a pit bull type dog, you had to own a home. So if that was going to make it a better match, and had to be 25 years or older, and all these things were just questions and assumptions and biases that were put in place that would disqualify people that may be really good pet owners of a dog. Let's talk a little bit about so you all have lots of years of experience. What differences did you see when you did drop barriers? What did you experience? Heather, you founded your organization Misha, you've been in the business since a long time, 42 years, you said?
The beginning of time.
Beginning of time. And Lawrence, you've worked in multiple states and multiple communities. I know you're in Jacksonville now, which is the a national model for organizations, but that's not where you've always been. This is a new leadership role for you that you've taken on, but all of you have worked in different organizations and you, Heather, you grew your organization. As you evolved, as you removed barriers, what did you experience?
So for the reason that we started removing barriers is because I was spending so much of my time doing all of these checks, and I was in the car constantly doing home checks, and I was so tired of it. I think there was one day also where we have a small adoption center where we have 8 dogs at a time. We usually have 300 animals in our care. Only 10 of them are in facility. The rest are in foster. And so that means we want these animals to get into the kennels faster. And someone came in on a Sunday to adopt a dog, and I was going to do a landlord check, but the property management was closed on that Sunday. So we made them wait until we reopened on Wednesday, where instead I could have sent that dog home and just trusted them and then put another dog in there, which meant a foster home would have been open, which meant I could have gone and saved another dog from Chicago Animal Care and Control where they were dying every single day. So to me, the logic just stopped making sense. So that's when we dropped it. And again, I said this before, we did not see a dramatic increase in any returns or anything bad happening to our animals. We saw a dramatic increase in adoptions. That year, I think it was 2015, when we really dropped most of our barriers, we were adopting about 400 animals a year, and now we're adopting 2,000. So to me, it's just allowed us to scale up and open up to our community in a way that has saved so many more animals.
Now that's dramatic.
And I don't have to be in the car all day anymore. So.
Yes. Saving gas. So, Tawny, I call it the what if syndrome, where somebody says, well, but what if we don't do this? What might happen, right? Mm-hmm. And so as an example, what if we don't do a landlord check and the landlord doesn't allow animals? What will happen? Well, either the animal will come back, or they'll rehome it somewhere else. Is that the worst thing in the world? I don't think so. And that's why over the years, I've lifted a lot of these things, just kind of saying, well, what if? What's the worst case scenario that could happen here? Now, aside from mistreatment, which we all know doesn't happen most of the time, it does happen some of the time. And we can't control that anyway. I don't care what you do, unless you know that they're a dog fighter and they're coming in for puppies or something. But we've removed things like, and again, I'm municipal, so a little bit different than nonprofit. We don't have any fees connected to our adoptions. We're not a money-based business anyway. It's not like we make a bunch of money on adoptions. And so it was a matter of convincing the upper echelons in the county or the city where I worked before that, the revenue really isn't worth the amount of time we're holding these animals and how much we pay to hold them. The numbers don't make any sense. So it's not a profit business. We're not making money. Take the fee out of it and just let people have the animals. Does it result in more people coming in who are irresponsible? We haven't seen that. We haven't seen additional returns. So things like that, and just trying it out to see what happens. And I believe we actually save ourselves money and our constituents money by doing that.
Well, it's a really good example. 2 really good examples from both of y'all.
Yeah, and to add similar, one of the last barriers that an organization I was with clung to for a really long time was requiring the resident dog to come in and meet the dog that we were adopting. Right? This required dog introduction because we wanted to make sure they were going to get along. Well, that's 5-10 minutes in a pen that smells like the shelter. Not more often than not, the resident dog, their dog would come and would just be awful because he's completely out of his element. He doesn't know what's going on. So I think we realized over time that, we're not getting any guarantee of how they're going to be in the home now, unmanaged, unsupervised, the owner's on their own. Maybe they listened to what we said, maybe they didn't. It doesn't, like, that forced introduction didn't increase the chances that that's going to work. It just stressed 2 dogs and at least 2 people out more than we probably needed to do to give them a chance to be successful. So I think that was, that's one of those examples that, to Misha's point, thinking about, what's the worst thing that's going to happen, and can we manage that, and then being comfortable with what that's going to look like. And I also really do think the conversation about adoption fees related to this is an important one, because my experience has been the same as Misha's, that, on the aggregate, when you think about it, if you're like, for us, it is a better business decision for us to charge lower fees and get the animals adopted sooner, because it costs us more to care for the pet. And to that same point, we have never seen that there's a lower level of care, or people are less committed to the pet because they were charged a lesser fee. I mean, nobody gives anybody else a hard time for waiting until Milk's buy one, get one free to buy 2 gallons. Like, we understand that's just, Milk's buy one, get one free next week. I'm going to buy 2 gallons, and that's okay. But we feel differently about this specific conversation. And I understand that, but I think it's 2 different things where, if you need to charge a fee to maintain and sustain your business, that's a different conversation than, I think that this fee is going to give me some higher level of confidence that the pet owner is a better pet owner. Those are 2 different things. So I think just being thoughtful about your adoption fees, the reasons why you're charging them, and does that fee make the most sense for your organization, knowing that your organization is a business, is an important perspective to have.
And Lawrence, I want to add, our model is donation based. And so what I have found is that people come in, they feel like they're doing a good thing adopting an animal, and then they feel like they do another good thing donating back to those same animals. And the way we have it set up is that those donations go into our quality of life fund, which is separate from our municipal general fund. So that money never goes back into the general fund. It goes right back into our programming.
Yeah, and same. And we have, there's one of our JHS staffers I see here on the attendee list, so she would echo the same, that we just recently, like 2 weekends ago, did a name your price adoption campaign. People could give whatever they wanted to give when they did an adoption, and we made more in adoption revenue by to give what they wanted than we would have with our set fees. People want to be generous. So it's just something else to think about and keep in mind as you're weighing those kinds of conversations.
There is also some interesting data that was shared that boomer generations aren't necessarily reacquiring pets after their last pets died because they're afraid of the costs associated with it. So if we can have ease the burden of cost by making the initial adoption free or reduced, that makes some people more comfortable. And so they're going to be more likely to come back and reacquire a pet, where we really need people to come back and adopt and acquire pets. And if they're not going to do it, if we don't make it more economically attractive, then we kind of don't have a choice. I saw some questions also about just like the fear of what do you do if like someone can't afford a pet. One of the things we did at One Tail was we made a fund that if someone had an emergency and they couldn't pay for it, we would give them a grant to help them pay for it. And so that's helped keep some of the animals in their homes. We also just have like a general program in Chicago that helps low-income people keep their pets by providing free services. And we've been able to fund that through crowdfunding and individual donations. And it's been a great way to make sure no one has to give up their pet because of financial reasons. So if we can do it in Chicago, I think you could do it anywhere.
Agreed. I totally agree. You all are one of the easiest panels ever in the history of panels and webinars to moderate. I feel like I just throw some kibble out there and you run, and I just am going, So you hit some really, really, really good points. No need for follow-up questions. Before we move away from this whole notion that, well, a couple things. Prior to the webinar starting, we were chatting in our green room, and we talked about how when we talk about removing barriers to adoptions, one of the things that we think about frequently is money, right? And making something low cost or free, but that's not, but that also affects a nonprofit's organization to keep the lights on and to keep the doors open. And so there's other ways to remove, it's not just money, you know, that are part of the barriers. What are some other, you know, we really didn't kind of talk about barriers. We talked about fear, but let's rattle off a little bit as a panel. What are some barriers you've seen in your lifetime that have gone bye-bye or are still floating around? Just start rattling them off.
I would say the most common ones I still see are veterinarian and reference checks and landlord checks. I think that those are some of the three most common and biggest barriers for many.
They're time consuming. Go ahead.
Mandatory waiting periods or like multiple processes, like you can't, no same day adoptions, you have to come back, you have to do a phone interview, an application, a home check, whatever.
Long adoption applications or any application at all, ID checks, not allowing active or large breed dogs to go with, you know, in certain places or with certain people, you know, senior citizens, adopting a puppy. By the way, I'm a senior and I just adopted a puppy. So yeah, those kinds of things.
For me, in my personal experience, and I don't know if this is continuing to happen, I was asked to bring, like Lawrence talked about, I had a dog. I was asked to bring my dog back in, and I also had children, and I was asked to bring my children in to see how they interact. I hope that's not continuing to happen, because what happened with that is I just didn't come back. I just went to a different place, right?
Yeah.
And so that definitely was a barrier for me.
And one of the things, oh, go ahead.
Tawny, I just wanted to say, I also think we punish the people who are honest. So I noticed in the chat earlier, someone was talking about declawing. If we think declawing does not take place, even when they don't say so, it does sometimes. So really, I think we do a lot of this stuff on the front end, thinking we're going to resolve issues when they get the animal home or out into the community, where probably we need to focus our attention on how do we help them in the community with the information that they need to do what it is that we would like them to do.
I think there's also like, you know, this idea that open adoptions means you give any person any animal, and it's really about matchmaking. So if you can do this individualized matchmaking conversation-based process, then you don't have to do generalized denial. So for example, my favorite story is I got denied from fostering a Great Pyrenees because I live in Chicago. Well, what did I do? I went and got my own Great Pyrenees from somewhere else, and I fostered several of them. So, you know, there's no reason to say certain animals can't go in certain places. Yeah, and maybe there was a farm dog that should not live in Chicago with me, but absolutely we shouldn't be doing these full generalized, like this breed can't go here, or this puppy can't go with this person. Let's make it an individualized process, because all dogs are individuals. We know that.
Yeah.
And
I'll say it again, it's
nobody
the
knows
illusion.
your home better than you do, Heather. Like, just think that I could sit over here and understand what your living situation is versus Misha's versus Dawn's versus anybody's is, you know, that's giving myself an awful lot of credit to have a clue there. I mean, you know what you can handle better than anybody. You know, you, Dawn, you knew your family better than I could ever know. So you need to have the autonomy and ability to choose the pet that's best for your family. Like, you deserve that right. We shouldn't stand in the way of that or think that we're somehow better informed as to what you can or can't manage in your home.
Misha, what were you going to say?
I was going to say it just circles back to that illusion of control that we believe that we have, that we really don't.
Yeah, I think one of the things I noticed coming into the field of animal services, because I came from another profession, I'd spent 25 years in Parks and Recreation and spent the last decade in animal services. What really blew me away is how certain everybody was of things that they couldn't be certain of. Certain of the breed. So they would guess on the kennel card and feel good about the guess, even though the guess was wrong and not based on any science or fact or data. And back then, we weren't saying looks like. We were saying that is a border collie. That is a beagle, Labrador retriever. I was like, no, it's not. Or it might look like one, but that's when we started doing genetic testing. And that was fun because then you have people guess, and it was a great way to learn without making, you know, with it being a fun way to learn. But you're right. There's just this certainty that we know what's best, or we can size you up based upon some questions we ask you, and we'll know what's best as opposed to you. So those are really, really good points. And punishing people for being honest is a strong one, Misha. That illusion of control is something that's really important. It's because we do love them. We do want them to be placed in the best home. We are doing our level best. But the fact of the matter is, if somebody's going to be honest, decline, which many of us find reprehensible, we find that totally inappropriate, and maiming and mutilation, having a conversation with them about alternatives when they're being honest about it, instead of just saying, you were honest. No. So what were you going to say, Misha?
I think if we're going to be truly inclusive, and accepting, we're calling this open adoptions, but I really think it's accessible adoptions, accessible to all people, and we're accessible to them as well. And I've seen the surveys done. I've seen it done at conferences where these questions that we ask of our customers, asking the same questions of shelter people in the industry. How many of you have ever had to give up a dog? How many of you have ever allowed your cat to go outside? How many of you don't have licenses for all of your pets, or up-to-date vaccinations, or all these things that we demand of everybody else? And yet, if you look throughout the industry, those things don't happen with a lot of us. And so if those things are not happening with the experts, then really, can we expect them to, can we have that expectation of our customers? Again, I would go back to, we need to put in place programming that assists them in doing what it is that we would like them to do, and what we want them to be able to achieve. If they say don't know, just simple lack of knowledge, and helping them obtain that knowledge.
Listening to you all talk, what really is striking to me is we're looking at moving from transactional, linear, black and white to relationship building. And instead of checking the boxes and meeting the requirements, and probably a good idea to stay away from education and more about resource sharing, right? We're sharing resources with each other and learning from each other. But we're moving away from that transactional animal pound, even animal shelter, I would say, and stepping into this relationship building model between the community and animal shelters. And one thing I wanted to say that I didn't get to say earlier, that I want us all to remember is, during the pandemic, when animal shelters, whether it was nonprofit or municipal, for different reasons, may have curtailed their operations. Maybe the shelter doors were shut for a while as pets were placed in foster, as as rescues, nonprofits and municipalities operated differently. And maybe we were short-staffed. We had people calling out sick. We had people quitting and changing professions. There was a lot of societal changes taking place during this worldwide pandemic that affected our economy, different industries, the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry. A lot of professions and fields were affected, and we were not immune to that. We were affected as well. But one thing I noticed, and that is puppy mills and puppy sales, commercial breeders didn't miss a stride. They increased their marketing, and they increased, during this webinar, we could have probably bought hundreds of puppies easily, put them in our cart online, and had the animal delivered to our home. And you think about how many people would have been on this webinar. And so to the panel, I want to say, more than ever, this behooves us to be innovative and to think about making those changes so people want to come to animal shelters, right? They want to come to us to acquire a pet. So Heather, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about how we can reduce barriers for foster-based rescues that aren't necessarily a bricks and mortar model, but they're foster-based? And how can those organizations drop some of those barriers, be more inclusive, and foster diversity? And Dawn, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, and I saw a lot of comments about people struggling with the fee reduction. I'd say you don't have to do that if you can't do that right now, but also little plug, if you're going to go to the Best Friends Conference, I'm doing a talk about our membership program, which is a sustainable giving program that I can help you scale up. I think being good fundraisers allows you to be more accessible to everyone. So I think that's super key, is making sure that's part of your process. But we have an adoption application because most of our animals are in fosters. So it doesn't mean you have to like get rid of everything. We just greatly reduce what's on the application. We just want to know the information so that we can best suggest animals. And if someone's like, I have 3 dogs and we have a dog that is very dog aggressive, we are not going to allow them to like do a meet and greet with that dog. So, but we'll steer them to someone else. We typically will do a Zoom call or just a phone call with the foster. And then if it's a match, we can do a meet and greet if they want. If not, then we just move forward with the adoption. And then we do same day, like, here you go, here's the leash, here's all the information. We send them the link through Shelter Love and then they check out. We don't even meet a lot of our adopters. We trust our fosters. We have run into some issues with some of the fosters who will be like, oh, I don't know, for whatever reason. And then we have to have a frank, direct discussion with the foster about why we do open, accessible adoptions and how we're not going to find the most wonderful, perfect home in the world for every animal, but that doesn't mean it's going to be not going to be a great home. So we definitely have to address that head on. But I would say if you get rid of like the waiting periods, the long applications, the judgmental questions, and make the process as easy as possible, you're going to do great.
I would just also add, like, I feel strongly what you said, Tawny, earlier. It's really about relationship building, right? And it's trust, like Heather said. Like, we trust our fosters, right? In making those decisions. I also think that what helps is having for people to know that people are going to have that post-adoption support, right? And that and people checking in so that people feel supported through the process, right? Maybe they're adopting for the first time, because sometimes this could be their first adoption, right? And I feel like that could be a barrier for people. So I think having that aspect, but then also having that relationship where you have that post-adoption type of thing happening, I think that can be very helpful as well.
Just another quick one for fosters. I think we all wish we had more fosters. So one thing we did to make it more accessible, and we have a lot of work to do, but we have an orientation, because it's not, you can just pick up an animal and then drop them off if you want. Like, our foster program is different than shelters. So we have an orientation with all the information. It takes people like 20 minutes. It's self-paced and online. So you don't have to come in. You don't have to like sign up for a webinar. You can do it whenever you want. So that makes it super accessible. We're working on a Spanish version of it too, so that we can reach more people. I think also, like, if you live somewhere where a different language is very popular, making sure that you have volunteers or staff that represent your community. So when we were hiring foster and adoption counselors, we made it a huge priority and a requirement that they had to be bilingual and speak Spanish, so that we can reach part of our population that we have not even like begun to tap into. There's so many wonderful adopters that speak Spanish, and we are just missing them.
Absolutely. That's all excellent. In closing, let's just talk a little bit about how we target the harder to adopt dogs and cats, some of the specialty techniques that we've thought about, and things that have worked for us. Because that's the big dogs, and the harder to adopt cats and dogs, those are the kind of what people are struggling or grappling with, wanting to get into loving homes and to get out of the shelter environment where they're not doing well.
The thing that's worked the best for us is to get them out of the shelter into a natural environment, like a park, a swimming pool. We've got a social media person who is amazing, who takes her boyfriend out, and they'll have the dog pull them on a skateboard or do all sorts of really creative things to show off that dog outside of the shelter environment, because just taking video or pictures in the shelter environment just has not worked.
Totally agree. We do a lot of the same. We have dog stay out programs, staycations. I mean, if we can get the dog out of the shelter for an hour for the afternoon, pictures and videos, go to the beach and let us know how it went. Here's the adoption vest. Tell everybody the pet's available for adoption. Those things really do make a huge difference, because those dogs that are the hardest to place are the ones that don't show very well in the shelter. So giving them that chance to be seen in their natural habitat, if you will, them being able to be themselves, and people can see themselves there at the beach with that dog too, and be able to imagine what that would look like, really does help place those guys that need that little bit of extra nudge.
All right. Well, we're pretty much, Caitlin, coming down to the top of the hour.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, I've got some closing remarks, but I want to make sure that you're good, Tawny, and the panelists before I sign us all off.
I am. Anybody want to share any parting words before we move to our closing announcements? I do want to thank, Misha, you're on.
I just wanted to say there was a question. Is our questions and answers going to be, part of this? Maybe you guys can add something at the conference. It sounds like topics that people really want to continue to discuss.
Yes, that is the main part of my closing remarks. So thank you for that, Misha. We got so many good questions in our Q&A, and this is a topic that is really important. So even though we didn't get to everyone's questions, or even most of them, they are really important. I took screenshots of all of them. I'm going to talk to the rest of the Best Friends Network team to make sure we can get you answers in some way. So we have a Facebook group for our network partners. We also have a recently launched Instagram page where we're sharing a lot of ideas like we discussed today. We also have some specific resources that you might use to figure out what of the ideas that were shared here today could you actually implement at your own shelter. I also want to end by saying thank you to our panelists. This was such a lively and interesting panel. Really excited about it. And again, I want to thank all of our attendees and anybody watching for being here. We called this webinar "Easy Changes to Make to Increase Adoptions." In a lot of ways, that's a true sentence. Like you could get rid of home visits and save yourself a lot of time and, get more adoptions. But at the same time, this is really hard stuff. It is complicated. It is emotional. Change is always hard. And it's also just hard to make time to do things like this. So really genuinely, thank you for making time for this and for all the work that you're doing for your pets and your community. And I hope we will see you next time.
Thank you, everyone.